I feel like 2023 was a good year in terms of taking giant leaps towards an actual smart home. We have access to over 2,600 integrations in Home Assistant now, and we saw some massive user experience enhancements thanks to Madalena and her team. But when automating the boring stuff, there are times that I think Home Assistant makes it harder than it should be. Here at the start of 2024, I've been thinking a lot about the future. The future of SlackerLabs and the changes I think will make my content better, but also the future of Home Assistant and what I really think would help it become the smart home platform for automating the boring stuff. So here are 5 things I would love to see added to Home Assistant this year. And we're not talking drag and drop or tags and folders for automations. Some of these would change how we work with Home Assistant. Okay, we've all been there. You add a new device to Home Assistant and it's gone. Well, not gone, but if you get excited and you forgot to name it, finding it in the list of devices might be a challenge, because perhaps it's not a device at all, but an entity, which is in a completely different panel. Or perhaps the manufacturer was set to unknown, making it impossible to locate it by the brand you know it as. Or if you added it via Zigbee to MQTT and didn't rename it, its name is its MAC address by default. So I think it would be helpful to have a filter to show recently added devices, which might be a bit of a challenge since it doesn't appear that Home Assistant records the date an entity was added in the entity registry. So perhaps an easier option is that all new entities and devices get assigned to a new device area that you can reference, but having Home Assistant highlight recently added devices and entities I think would make the whole experience just a little better. Scenes can be useful for creating an entity preset, and the UI editor can be helpful for creating scenes. You just click Add, give it a name, and then start adding devices and entities you want to include. By default, they'll be saved with their current state, which makes it perfect for those times in which you want to get everything set just right, and then save it as a scene. The issue, though, is when you want to edit a scene. As soon as you open the scene to edit, Home Assistant applies that scene, which can really tick off those living in your house, as well as those of you trying to edit it. And I get why this exists. Being able to edit a scene with visual feedback can be extremely helpful, but a better experience would be to provide a test button or an apply button in the editor, allowing you to make changes and then apply the scene to test. I mean, the automation editor gives you the ability to run an automation after you've created it. So for now, I use the UI to add new scenes, and then edit existing scenes via the YAML. So here's to hope that the team can improve the scene editor so we don't have to cause a scene every time we want to edit a scene. Room presence is one of those things that would enable us to build a smarter smart home. And as of 2024, it's not easy to get set up, because room presence only becomes really valuable when it's more than just knowing if there are people in the room. Context around what those people are doing is extremely important. You would want your smart home to automate a room where people were present but sleeping differently than a room where people were present and watching a movie, although some people do enjoy sleeping through movies. So room presence to me is more than person detection, and Home Assistant in many cases probably already has the signals it needs, it just hasn't given us a way to connect the dots. I've created a template sensor that gets the job mostly done, but I would love to have a room presence, or better yet a situation presence, entity that works just like the current person entity. A framework that allows us to choose the signals or devices that provide context in a particular situation, which probably sounds super complicated, but in essence would work like the groups do today. The state of the group is based on all of the states of the entities that make up that group. I've always said that building smart automations is about having the automation understand the right context, and I think a situation presence entity would help us better define situations and get that type of information into our automations, which would make them smarter. Continuing on the theme of show us the context, let's talk about entity relationships. Those familiar with object-oriented programming will understand inheritance and how classes can reference attributes of other classes. I would love to see something similar in Home Assistant. Today, we can define a person entity, which in essence inherits its state from the entities that are assigned to it. But what if that idea was expanded further? Because a person inside of Home Assistant can have a relationship with other entities, like a workday sensor, which could provide context around a specific person's work schedule, or at least did until that dream was killed by the recent move to the integration flow, in which the functionality was changed so you can't have more than one workday sensor with the same schedule. Meaning, even though right now my wife's work schedule and mine align, they don't always. Which means to make this work, I would have to continually check and then change which workday sensor provided the right context. So I doubt this is something the Home Assistant team is going to want to entertain. But my idea is that each working person in your home would have their own workday sensor. That sensor would then be linked to their person entity. So when I wanted to create an alarm for that specific person, the state of the workday sensor would be an attribute of their person entity, making building person-based automations easier. For the person entity, Home Assistant already knows that all of the attributes of the devices linked to that entity are related. But to use them in an automation, you have to know the specific entity. You can't just reference them as an attribute of the person entity, which in essence they are. But it doesn't have to stop there. Areas could have some of this same relationship context as well. Perhaps even have a state that indicates if they're occupied based on a presence sensor linked to that area. Or in cases where you have multiple temperature sensors in a room, average the temperature of all of those entities and provide a single value as an attribute to that area, so that you could ask Home Assistant what the temperature was in, say, the kitchen, and it would use that attribute of the area. There's so much possibility here that would make Home Assistant smarter. We just need the ability to connect the dots. And lastly, the dreaded Home Assistant update. Alright, it's the moment of truth. We're going to hit this upgrade button for 2024.1.2, and so far from what I've heard or seen online, this one has not gone as smooth for a lot of people. So, fingers crossed. Home Assistant added the repair notices, which has been extremely helpful. And the reality is, hitting the update button today is less stressful than it has been in the recent past. And that's all to do with the massive effort the team has made into improving the stability of the platform. But there are still changes that impact our smart homes in ways we didn't really see when we read the release notes. I look at the recent change to the calendar service list events, in which the team didn't just modify that service, but created a whole new service with new functionality to replace it, letting users have a few months to migrate over as proof that they take this update dread users have seriously. Because modifying the original service would have definitely broken people's automations. But I would love Home Assistant to provide a little bit of context inside the update notification about the impacts to the current smart home, essentially showcasing the same repair type notice, but indicating how our current system is going to be impacted prior to hitting that update button. Like you hit the update button and get a little message that pops up. Yo Jeff, I'm really happy you want to update, and I'm gonna let you finish. But did you know that there are some entities that reference a service that will not exist after this update? I'm going to disable them so they don't create errors. In this case, you could stop the update and address it yourself. The users would have a little more awareness around the things that were going to be an issue after they update, and give them a chance to opt out until they actually go read the release notes or come up with a way to address it. Now, of course, I have no clue about the level of effort to bring any of these ideas to life. I don't even know if they're possible. But when automating the boring stuff, I like to dream.